A wall of dust moves across the open plains long before the rider is visible. It rises first as a faint disturbance on the horizon, a smudge against a sky that seems too wide to contain it, then thickens into something almost living, rolling forward with the slow inevitability of weather that has learned to walk. The land beneath it is already worn thin, grass is cropped low by endless hooves, soil loosened by years of passage. And the wind carries the memory of thousands of crossings before this one. Somewhere inside that moving haze, cattle shift and press together, their bodies forming a restless current guided not by vision but by instinct and pressure from behind. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, what unfolds across the frontier in this era is not yet a legend. It is not the polished image of lone riders against sunsets, or the stylized figure that later generations will inherit through cinema. Instead, it is labour at its most raw and exposed, a system built from distance, exhaustion, and necessity. Every movement here is dictated by survival in a landscape that offers no shelter by default. Water is not guaranteed, shade is rare, and the horizon, which always appears close, never actually arrives. The cowboy exists first as a worker, not a symbol. He's part of a broader machinery of cattle, land, and market demand that stretches far beyond the visible trail. His day begins before light fully settles into the sky. When the world is still a muted gradient of grey and blue, horses are already restless, sensing the long hours ahead. The cattle, too, begin to stir, shifting weight in slow anticipation. Nothing in this world moves quickly unless it is startled. Even urgency here has a measured pace, shaped by the need not to break what is already fragile. The frontier itself is not empty, despite what later stories sometimes imply. It is vast, yes, and often unmarked by permanent structures, but it is not void. It is a living landscape of grasslands, river systems, migrating herds, and human pathways that have existed long before the cattle drives begin to formalize them. Indigenous nations have moved across these same plains for centuries, following buffalo, seasonal cycles, and trade routes that do not always leave visible traces. The arrival of large-scale cattle movement does not create a new world from nothing. It collides with an older one already in motion. In this early phase, the relationship between rider and land is not romantic. It is practical, often harsh. A cowboy learns quickly that distance is not measured in miles alone, but in fatigue, weather, and the condition of both horse and herd. A single misjudgment can scatter hundreds of animals into chaos that takes days to repair. There is no centralized control, no immediate communication, only the slow logic of positioning and response. Sound carries further than sight in some cases. And even then, wind can distort intention into confusion. The cattle themselves are not passive participants. They are reactive, sensitive to pressure, easily spooked by sudden noise or movement. A cracked branch, a shifting shadow, or an unfamiliar scent can send ripples through a herd that behaves like a single organism. The cowboy's role, in many ways, is to maintain balance within that organism, guiding without forcing, steering without breaking cohesion. It is a skill that cannot be rushed into existence. It is learned through repetition, failure, and long exposure to unpredictability. By the time cattle drives begin to define the economic rhythm of the plains, the scale of movement becomes almost difficult to comprehend. Thousands of animals may travel together across routes that stretch for hundreds of miles. These journeys are not straight lines. They bend toward water sources, avoid harsh terrain, and respond to conditions that shift weekly or even daily. The land becomes a map that redraws itself continuously under pressure of hooves and weather. Yet even in this early expansion, there is already a sense of tension building beneath the surface. Markets in distant cities begin to demand more beef. Railroads push outward, inching closer to regions that once required months of overland travel to reach. The cowboy stands at the intersection of these forces without fully seeing their long-term consequences. For him, the trail is immediate, the herd is immediate, the next river crossing, the next storm. The next night of minimal sleep defines reality more than any distant economic system. Still, something about this way of life begins to draw attention even in its own time. Reports travel eastward about the scale of movement, the endurance required, and the strange, almost rhythmic order that emerges from chaos. Outsiders imagine danger, freedom, and solitude in equal measure. Some of these impressions are accurate in fragments, but they rarely capture the full texture of daily existence, where boredom can stretch as long as fear, and routine becomes a kind of survival mechanism. The dust that marks the cattle trail is more than a visual effect. It is a signature left on the land, a temporary scar that fades slowly after passage. In that dust are fragments of hoof, wheel, boot, and wind. It clings to clothing, settles into lungs, and becomes part of the body's memory of movement. Even after stopping, long after the herd has moved on, the sensation of dust persists, as if the land refuses to release those who pass through it. And somewhere within all of this, the cowboy begins to emerge as a recognizable figure, not yet mythologized, not yet simplified, but present as a necessary component of a larger system that depends on endurance more than glamour. He exists between exhaustion and alertness, between control and uncertainty, always positioned slightly behind or beside the herd rather than in front of it. The horizon remains both destination and illusion, always receding as it is approached. What survives from this early moment in the cowboy story is not clarity, but atmosphere, a sense of movement across something vast and indifferent, a world where human effort is constant but never fully dominant over environment, and beneath it all, an unspoken question about how long such a balance can hold before pressure from economy, technology, and time begins to reshape everything that seems stable. The cowboy does not begin as a figure of legend, and he does not appear fully formed out of the frontier myth that will later define him. Instead, he emerges gradually from a shifting set of labour needs, shaped less by romance than by economic pressure and geographic necessity. In the decades leading toward large-scale cattle expansion, the American West is already undergoing a slow transformation, where land that once supported seasonal movement and scattered settlements is increasingly drawn into systems of production that demand constant attention and labour. The origins of this culture are not tied to a single invention or moment. They form instead through accumulation. Ranching practices evolve as settlers, soldiers, freed workers, and migrants bring different skills into the same landscape. Some arrive with experience managing livestock in the eastern states, where farms are smaller and more controlled. Others come from regions where open grazing and seasonal movement are already familiar. These influences do not merge neatly. They overlap, conflict, and gradually settle into a working rhythm shaped by necessity rather than design. At the centre of this emerging system is cattle, not as symbols of wealth in abstraction, but as living units of labour and trade. Their value is measured in movement and survival across distance. The question is not only how to raise them, but how to move them, protect them, and deliver them to markets that may be months away. This requirement reshapes the relationship between humans and land in subtle but permanent ways. The frontier is no longer simply a space to occupy. Early ranch work is still fragmented and localised, herds are smaller, fences are limited, and control over animals depends heavily on human presence rather than infrastructure. This creates a labour demand that is constant and physically demanding. Someone must always be watching, guiding, repairing, and responding. The cowboy role grows out of this need for perpetual supervision, especially in regions where open range makes containment impossible without constant movement. In these early stages, work is not standardized. There is no fixed job description that fully captures what is required. A single worker might be responsible for riding long distances to check cattle, repairing equipment, assisting with branding, or tracking animals that have wandered beyond the main herd. The skills needed are varied and often learned informally. Instruction comes through repetition and observation rather than formal training. Mistakes are costly, but unavoidable. The landscape itself enforces this learning process. Wide grasslands stretch in every direction, broken only by rivers, ridges, and occasional settlements. Weather shifts quickly, and visibility can change within minutes. A rider may leave under clear skies and return through a storm that erases tracks and disorients both animal and human. In such conditions, memory becomes as important as navigation. Experienced cowboys begin to read the land in ways that are not immediately visible to outsiders, noticing subtle changes in vegetation, soil firmness, and animal behaviour that signal shifts ahead. The economic pressure behind this system grows steadily. After the Civil War, demand for beef increases significantly in urban centres across the United States. Cities expand rapidly, and with them the need for reliable food sources. Cattle become part of a national supply chain that stretches across regions still only loosely connected by infrastructure. This demand transforms what had been a regional practice into a large-scale industry. The cowboy, once a local labourer, becomes part of a broader economic network. Even as this expansion begins, uncertainty remains constant. Prices fluctuate, routes change, and weather patterns can disrupt entire seasons of planning. A successful drive is never guaranteed. Herds can be lost to disease, theft, storms, or simple misdirection. No single authority controls the entire process. Instead, it operates through coordination among ranchers, riders, traders, and emerging transport systems that are still unreliable in many areas. Language within this emerging culture also begins to shift. Terms borrowed from Spanish-speaking vaquero traditions blend with English and regional dialects, forming a vocabulary that reflects the mixed origins of the work itself. Words related to cattle handling, writing techniques, and equipment often carry traces of earlier systems, quietly preserving a history that is sometimes overlooked in simplified accounts of the American West. What is often missed in later retellings is how experimental this period truly is. There is no fixed model for how ranching should operate across vast, open land at this scale. Every region adapts differently. Some rely more heavily on seasonal movement, others begin to experiment with early forms of enclosure, and still others remain committed to open range practices despite increasing risk. The cowboy exists within this uncertainty, adapting constantly to shifting expectations. Surprisingly, much of the early cowboy world is not defined by isolation but by networks of cooperation. Ranchers depend on one another during difficult seasons. Riders may travel between operations depending on demand. Information about weather, cattle movement, and market conditions circulates through informal channels. In this sense, the frontier is not entirely disconnected. It is loosely connected, held together by relationships that are practical rather than institutional. Still, the physical reality of the work remains demanding. Long hours in the saddle, exposure to extreme weather, and constant unpredictability shape the body as much as the mind. Injuries are common, though rarely recorded in detail. Fatigue becomes a baseline condition rather than an exception. Over time, endurance itself becomes a defining feature of those who remain in the profession. What begins to emerge from all of this is not a heroic archetype, but a labour identity shaped by environment, economy, and necessity. The cowboy is not created by myth at this stage, he is created by demand. And as cattle economies expand, this role becomes more structured, more essential, and more deeply embedded in the transformation of the American landscape. Beneath the growing system, however, there remains a sense of instability. The same openness that allows movement also prevents control. The same freedom that enables expansion also introduces risk. The early cowboy world exists in this tension, balanced between opportunity and fragility, still unaware that the forces driving its expansion will eventually begin to reshape or even dismantle the very conditions that made it possible. Before the American cowboy becomes a recognizable figure on the plains, long before cattle drive stretch across entire territories, there is another world already in motion beneath it, one that carries its own language of rope, saddle, herd, and survival. In the heat-dried landscapes of Spanish colonial frontiers and later Mexican ranching territories, the vaquero tradition develops over centuries, not as a romantic ideal, but as a working system adapted to harsh. Open land where control over animals depends entirely on skill, timing, and an intimate understanding of behaviour. On these earlier ranches, cattle are not simply livestock, they are the foundation of land use, trade, and status. Managing them across wide, unfenced terrain requires a level of horsemanship that is both precise and instinctive. Riders learn to read movement before it fully forms, to anticipate direction changes in a herd the way others might read weather. The horse becomes more than transportation, it is an extension of perception itself. Trained to respond to subtle cues that often appear invisible to outsiders, the tools that later define the cowboy are already present here in refined form. The lasso, or riata, is not just a rope, but a practiced extension of the rider's arm, used with a consistency that only comes from years of repetition. Saddles are engineered for long hours of labour in the saddle, designed to distribute weight across horse and rider during work that may last from dawn until night, even the clothing boots shaped for stirrups. Hats designed for sun and rain emerges as practical adaptation before it becomes cultural iconography. These practices do not remain isolated. As borders shift and political control over the region changes in the 19th century, especially after the incorporation of Mexican territories into the United States, the labour systems of vaqueros begin to merge with incoming Anglo-American ranching methods. The transition is not immediate or clean, it is gradual, uneven, and often invisible in official records. But its influence is deeply embedded in the techniques that will later define the American West. Many of the words that become standard in cowboy vocabulary originate from this earlier world. Terms used for cattle handling, riding manoeuvres, and equipment carry linguistic traces of Spanish origin, preserved not through formal adoption, but through continuous use among workers who shared the same practical realities. This blending of language reflects something larger than terminology. It reflects a shared environment, where effectiveness mattered more than origin. The vaquero tradition itself is not static. It evolves across generations in response to changing land use, population pressures, and shifting trade routes. Herd sizes expand and contract depending on market demand and regional stability. Riders adapt continuously, developing techniques for controlling larger groups of cattle over longer distances, often with limited support. In many ways, the intellectual foundation of cattle, driving understanding herd psychology, movement patterns. An environmental response is already fully developed before it is widely recognized in the northern plains. When Anglo-American cattle ranching begins to expand into these same regions, the encounter between systems is practical rather than theoretical. Skills are exchanged in real time on the ground. A rider does not need to understand the historical origin of a technique to recognize its usefulness. Over time, what emerges is not a replacement of one system by another, but a synthesis shaped by necessity. The cowboy figure that later becomes iconic is already, at its core, a hybrid creation. Yet even within this blending, differences remain in emphasis and organization. Some ranching systems prioritize more formal hierarchy, while others rely heavily on individual autonomy and experience. What remains consistent across both traditions is the central challenge managing semi-wild animals across vast landscapes without the support of permanent containment. This challenge forces a kind of practical intelligence that is difficult to replicate in controlled environments. The land itself plays an active role in shaping these methods. Open plains, rolling hills, and river networks create natural pathways that cattle tend to follow, but these routes are never fully predictable. Weather events can alter migration patterns in a single season, drought can compress movement into narrow corridors of survival, while rain can expand grazing areas unexpectedly. The rider's understanding of land is therefore never fixed. It must remain flexible, responsive, and constantly updated through experience. What is often overlooked in simplified histories is how deeply knowledge is embedded in observation rather than instruction. Vaqueros and later cowboys learn by doing, by failing, and by watching the consequences of small decisions ripple outward across herds and terrain. There is little separation between learning and working. Each day on horseback becomes both labour and education, where mistakes are not theoretical but immediate. As these systems merge into what will become American cowboy culture, the transformation is not only technical but also social. People from different backgrounds, indigenous communities, Mexican ranch workers, European settlers, freed labourers find themselves operating within overlapping spaces of necessity. Their contributions are unevenly recorded in later historical narratives, but their presence is fundamental to the functioning of the system itself. In the background of this convergence, political boundaries continue to shift, and ownership of land becomes increasingly formalized. What was once open and fluid begins to be surveyed, divided, and claimed under new legal frameworks. This transition introduces tensions that will later define much of the frontier experience, but in this early stage, the focus remains on practical survival and production. The vaquero influence does not fade as the cowboy identity develops. Instead, it becomes woven into it at a structural level, embedded in technique, vocabulary, and working rhythm. Even as new economic forces begin to reshape the scale of cattle production, the foundational knowledge that allows such expansion remains rooted in this earlier tradition of skilled riders working in unpredictable or open environments. What emerges from this layered history is not a single origin point, but a braided formation of cultures and practices, each responding to the same fundamental challenge of controlling movement across vast land. The cowboy, when he appears fully formed in later decades, carries within him this accumulated history, one that is often invisible in myth, but essential to understanding how the system truly functioned. The moment the cattle boom begins, the plains stop feeling like distance and start behaving like infrastructure. What had once been a landscape crossed by small herds and seasonal movement becomes a vast, accelerating system of extraction and delivery, where grass is no longer just grass, but feed for a national appetite that grows faster than the land can quietly support. The change does not arrive all at once. It builds through pressure, through markets far away that begin to pull harder than the horizon pushes back. In the years following the Civil War, the United States enters a period of rapid reconstruction and expansion. Cities swell in size, populations concentrate, and demand for cheap, reliable beef rises sharply. In eastern markets, meat becomes a daily expectation rather than a seasonal luxury. This demand radiates outward, reaching into regions where cattle are abundant but inaccessible without long, dangerous transport routes. The economic imbalance between where cattle exist and where they are needed becomes the central problem that reshapes the entire frontier. At the same time, railroads begin to extend their reach across the continent. These lines of iron and wood are not yet fully complete, but they already act like veins forming across a growing body. They do not eliminate distance, but they begin to reorganize it. Suddenly, a cow raised in the southern plains can be sold in Chicago, New York, or beyond, provided it can first survive the journey northward to a railhead. This simple requirement transforms the cowboy's role from local herder into a key link in a continental supply chain. The cattle boom is not driven by romance or adventure, it is driven by numbers. One animal in Texas might be worth a few dollars locally, but many times that value once delivered to distant urban markets. This price difference creates urgency, and urgency creates movement. Ranchers begin to scale up operations quickly, sometimes beyond what the land can sustainably support, because the opportunity feels temporary and therefore must be seized. What emerges across the plains is a network of long-distance drives designed to bridge this gap between production and consumption. Herds are gathered, sorted, and pushed into motion toward railheads in Kansas and beyond. These routes are not fixed highways, but evolving pathways that shift based on weather, grazing conditions, water availability, and the presence of other herds. The land becomes a constantly adjusted map, redrawn in real time by hooves and human judgment. The scale of these drives is difficult to fully imagine without standing within them. Thousands of cattle move together as a single drifting mass, guided by a small group of riders positioned at strategic points around the herd. Each cowboy has a role that is both specific and flexible, adjusting constantly to the behavior of animals that can never be fully controlled. The herd is never static. It breathes, sways, breaks, reforms, and reacts to every change in its environment. Despite the growing systemization of cattle movement, the work remains intensely personal and physically demanding. A single misstep in timing or positioning can send part of the herd scattering, creating hours or days of recovery work. Weather compounds this instability. A sudden storm can turn a planned route into a dangerous obstacle course. Rivers rise unpredictably, grass dries out, and dust storms reduce visibility to almost nothing, forcing decisions to be made based on instinct more than sight. The economic optimism of the cattle boom also hides a quieter instability. Ranchers expand herds aggressively, sometimes overgrazing land that cannot recover quickly. This creates cycles of abundance and strain that are not immediately visible, but begin to shape the long-term viability of the system. Scholars still debate how much of the later collapse of certain ranching regions was inevitable versus accelerated by this rapid expansion. But the evidence suggests that pressure on the land was steadily increasing throughout this period. For the cowboy, however, these larger economic forces are mostly background noise. His immediate reality remains tied to movement, herd behavior, and survival on the trail. Yet even at the level of daily labor, the scale of operations begins to change how work is experienced. Drives become longer, coordination becomes more complex, and the margin for error becomes smaller as competition for rail access intensifies. Railheads themselves become temporary boom towns. Towns like Abilene and Dodge City emerge almost overnight, shaped entirely by the arrival of cattle, cowboys, traders, gamblers, and suppliers. These places exist because the system demands a point of exchange where livestock can be transferred from open range to rail transport. Once established, they develop their own rhythms of commerce and conflict, shaped by the sudden concentration of wealth and movement. In these towns, The cowboy briefly becomes visible as a public figure. After weeks on the trail, riders arrive covered in dust, exhausted, carrying wages that will be spent quickly on food, supplies, and temporary relief from isolation. The contrast between the controlled chaos of the trail and the concentrated chaos of rail towns is sharp. One is spread across miles of land, the other compressed into streets of wood, noise, and constant transaction. Yet even here, the system remains fragile. Delays in rail schedules, market fluctuations, and weather disruptions can cause entire herds to lose value or miss critical shipping windows. The cattle boom operates on tight margins of timing and coordination that are easily disrupted. Success depends not only on endurance in the saddle, but on alignment with systems far beyond the cowboy's control. What defines this era most clearly is not stability, but acceleration. Everything moves faster: cattle, money, settlement, and expectation. The cowboy stands at the center of this acceleration, not as its cause, but as one of its most essential instruments, and his work translates vast open land into measurable economic value, turning distance into delivery. And yet, beneath this acceleration, the same uncertainty persists. The land does not fully conform. Weather resists prediction, herds resist control, markets fluctuate beyond local influence. The cattle boom, for all its expansion, is built on a foundation that remains as unpredictable as the plains themselves. Out on the ranches, far from the noise of rail towns and the pressure of distant markets, life settles into a rhythm that feels less like progress and more like repetition stretched across an enormous landscape. There is no clear boundary between work and environment here. The ranch is not a contained space, but a living section of the plains, open to weather, migration, and everything that moves through it. Days begin before light fully arrives. When the sky is still holding on to the last trace of night, and the air carries a coldness that fades only after hours of motion. The work itself is rarely dramatic in the way later stories suggest. It is built from routine tasks repeated endlessly under changing conditions. Horses are fed, saddles checked, fences repaired where they exist, and cattle accounted for in numbers that are always slightly uncertain. Even on well-managed ranches, there is a constant awareness that animals have moved during the night, that weather may have altered the ground, that something small and unnoticed might have shifted the balance of the herd. Control is never complete. It is maintained through attention rather than enforcement. Isolation is one of the defining conditions of ranch life, though it is not always experienced as loneliness in the emotional sense often imagined from the outside. Instead, it becomes a kind of spatial awareness, a recognition that human contact is rare and must be made meaningful when it occurs. Weeks may pass with only a handful of interactions beyond the immediate working group. The land itself becomes the primary presence, not as scenery, but as a constant force that must be understood and negotiated with every day. Ranches vary widely in size and organisation. Some are small family-run operations where every person contributes to daily survival. Others span vast tracts of land, employing dozens of workers whose responsibilities shift depending on season and need. In both cases, hierarchy exists but remains flexible. Experience often matters more than formal position. A skilled rider may carry more influence in practical decisions than someone with ownership but limited knowledge of the terrain. The physical demands of this life are continuous and cumulative. Fatigue does not arrive as a single event but accumulates gradually, embedded in muscle and bone. Long hours in the saddle shape posture and perception. Hands become conditioned to rope, leather, and reins in ways that persist even at rest. Sleep, when it comes, is often short and irregular, shaped by the needs of animals rather than human schedules. There is a quiet acceptance that rest is temporary and always subject to interruption. Food on ranches is functional rather than varied. Meals are prepared quickly, often in bulk, designed to sustain energy rather than provide comfort. Cooking is tied to practicality, using ingredients that store well and can be prepared under simple conditions. The act of eating itself becomes secondary to the work that follows or precedes it. Over time, even this minimal structure becomes part of the routine that defines the ranch environment. Despite the harshness, there are moments of subtle observation that reveal a deeper relationship between workers and land. Experienced ranch hands begin to recognize patterns in animal behavior that signal changes in weather or terrain conditions. A shift in how cattle cluster, the direction they face at rest, or their movement toward water sources can indicate changes long before they become obvious. This kind of knowledge is rarely written down. It is transmitted through observation and shared experience, forming an informal system of environmental reading. The ranch also operates as a space of constant repair. Nothing remains intact for long. Fences break, equipment wears down, and structures degrade under exposure to wind, sun, and moisture. Maintenance is not a separate task, but an ongoing condition of existence. To live and work on a ranch is to accept that everything must be continually restored to a usable state. This creates a mindset where impermanence is normal, and stability is something actively maintained rather than assumed. Social structure within ranch life reflects this constant adaptation. Workers form temporary bonds based on shared labour and proximity rather than long-term planning. These relationships can be strong, but they are often shaped by movement, with individuals shifting between ranches or roles depending on need and opportunity. Stability in employment is not guaranteed, and many workers move seasonally or in response to changing conditions across the region. What is rarely captured in simplified accounts of cowboy life is the sheer amount of time spent in uneventful motion, riding for hours across familiar terrain, checking boundaries, or simply moving cattle between grazing areas fills large portions of the day. These moments are not empty in experience, but they are repetitive, requiring attention without providing novelty. Over time, this repetition shapes perception itself, making subtle changes in the environment more noticeable than dramatic ones. Weather remains one of the most unpredictable elements of ranch existence. A clear morning can turn into a storm by afternoon. Wind can shift direction without warning, altering temperature and visibility in ways that affect both cattle and riders. Drought can slowly reshape entire regions, changing grazing patterns and forcing long-term adjustments in herd management. In contrast, heavy rain can temporarily transform dry land into difficult terrain, complicating movement and increasing risk. Even within this demanding environment, there is a quiet sense of continuity. Skills are passed from one worker to another, not through formal instruction, but through shared activity. A younger rider learns by observing how an older one responds to difficult cattle, how they position themselves in relation to wind, or how they anticipate movement before it happens. This learning process is gradual and often invisible, embedded in daily repetition rather than explicit teaching. The ranch, in this sense, becomes more than a workplace. It is a system of survival, adaptation, and constant recalibration between human effort and environmental reality. It does not offer certainty, but it does offer structure. Within that structure, the cowboy's life takes shape not as a series of extraordinary events, but as an ongoing negotiation with land, animals, and time itself. A horse stands still in the half-light before dawn, but nothing about it is truly at rest. The muscles under its coat shift with small adjustments against the cold, its ears turning towards sounds that humans barely register, its breathing steady but alert in a way that suggests readiness rather than calm. For the cowboy, this animal is not separate from the work ahead. It is the work ahead, already in motion while the world is still waking. On the plains, horsemanship is not an added skill, it is the foundation of survival and effectiveness. Without a reliable horse, distance becomes unmanageable, cattle become uncontrollable, and time itself stretches beyond practical limits. A rider learns early that control is never absolute. It is a negotiation between weight, balance, pressure, and response. The smallest shift in reins or posture can alter direction, speed, or intention over time. This communication becomes so refined that it appears almost invisible from the outside. What defines this relationship is repetition under uncertainty. No 2 days of riding are identical. Terrain changes, animals behave differently, weather alters perception. A horse that is calm in one situation may react unpredictably in another, and the rider must adjust instantly without hesitation. This constant adaptation creates a form of awareness that blends instinct with learned precision. It is not simply riding, it is reading movement before it fully exists. Training begins long before a horse is trusted in open range conditions. Young animals are introduced gradually to weight, direction, and voice cues. They learn not through punishment but through consistency and exposure. Experienced cowboys understand that force alone breaks trust faster than it builds control. Instead, they rely on patterns-repeated signals that shape expectation over time. A well-trained horse does not obey blindly. It anticipates. The equipment used in this process reflects the same philosophy of practical adaptation. Saddles are designed to distribute pressure across both horse and rider, reducing strain during long hours of movement. Reins, bits, and ropes are not decorative but functional extensions of communication. Even minor adjustments in gear can affect endurance across a full day of riding. Nothing is accidental. Everything serves a purpose that becomes clearer only through use. Roping, in particular, stands at the center of cowboy skill. It is not simply about throwing a loop of rope around an animal, it is about timing, distance, and prediction of motion. A successful throw depends on understanding how a target will move a moment before it does. Missed attempts are not rare, especially in difficult terrain or among restless herds. But with repetition, the motion becomes almost automatic, embedded in muscle memory shaped by countless corrections. The horse and rider gradually form a shared system of perception. The rider feels subtle changes in gait, tension, and direction that signal shifts in the environment. The horse, in turn, responds to pressure and balance that guide its decisions without requiring verbal instruction. This mutual responsiveness is essential in managing cattle, where speed and unpredictability can escalate quickly if control is lost even briefly. Cattle handling itself depends heavily on this coordination. When a herd begins to scatter, it is often the positioning of riders on horseback that determines whether movement stabilizes or collapses into chaos. Horses are used not just for mobility, but for influence, shaping the perimeter of the herd and redirecting flow without direct confrontation. In this way, the horse becomes part of a larger behavioral system, interacting not only with humans, but with the collective psychology of the animals being driven. Yet despite this sophistication, unpredictability remains constant. A sudden noise can trigger a chain reaction through a herd, forcing rapid repositioning. Uneven ground can destabilize both horse and rider, especially during high-speed movement. Even the most experienced partnerships are tested regularly by conditions that cannot be fully controlled or anticipated. Scholars still debate how much of successful cattle work is skill versus accumulated experience, reacting to chance in real time. The physical cost of this labor is significant. Long hours in the saddle place continuous strain on the body, joints absorb repeated impact, muscles remain engaged for extended periods, and fatigue builds in ways that are not always immediately noticeable. Over time, riders develop endurance thresholds that would be difficult to maintain in other environments. Pain becomes normalized, not ignored, but integrated into daily functioning. Despite this, moments of precision bring a different kind of awareness. A perfectly timed turn, a successful rope catch, or a calm herd response creates brief alignment between human intention and environmental behavior. These moments are rare enough to be noticeable, but not rare enough to feel mythical to those who experience them regularly. They are part of the work, not exceptions to it. The landscape itself plays an active role in shaping horsemanship. Open plains demand long-distance endurance, while broken terrain requires careful balance and adjustment. River crossings introduce risk that must be assessed quickly, sometimes with incomplete information. Weather can alter ground conditions in ways that affect traction, visibility, and herd behavior simultaneously. The rider must interpret all of these factors while remaining in motion. Communication between riders also relies heavily on non-verbal systems. Gestures, positioning, and timing replace spoken instruction in many situations where noise would interfere with awareness. Over time, groups develop shared understanding that allows coordination with minimal exchange. This efficiency is essential when managing large herds over unpredictable terrain. What emerges from all of this is not simply a technical skill set, but a way of existing in motion. Horsemanship on the frontier is a continuous state of attention, where awareness extends beyond immediate surroundings into the behavior of animals, the condition of land, and the shifting signals of weather. It is a discipline shaped by necessity, refined through repetition, and sustained by the constant requirement to respond faster than uncertainty can escalate. In this environment, control is never complete, but it is constantly pursued. The horse and rider move together through a world that does not stabilize, carrying with them a shared understanding that survival depends not on certainty, but on responsiveness. A herd begins to move before anyone gives a clear command, as if the decision to travel has already formed somewhere within its collective behavior. One animal shifts, then another, and within moments the entire mass begins to drift forward, slow at first, then gathering coherence as pressure builds from behind. On the open plains, this is the beginning of a cattle drive, though nothing about it feels like the start of something orderly. It is more like a slow negotiation between uncertainty and direction, where control must be earned continuously rather than assumed. The scale of these movements is what transforms them from ranch work into something closer to an infrastructure of migration. Thousands of cattle may be gathered for a single journey, pulled from scattered grazing grounds into a single moving body. This process alone requires days of preparation. Riders spread out across wide terrain, locating strays, guiding small groups inward, and slowly compressing distance until the herd becomes manageable as a whole, even before the first mile is travelled. Exhaustion has already begun to accumulate. When movement finally begins, it is never linear. The herd does not travel like a line, but like a shifting cloud, constantly adjusting shape in response to terrain, wind, and internal pressure. Cowboys position themselves around the edges, not directing every step but influencing flow, preventing fragmentation, and correcting direction when drift becomes too strong. Their role is less about command and more about containment, maintaining coherence in something that naturally wants to disperse. The land through which these drives pass is not passive. Grasslands change texture depending on season and rainfall, affecting how hooves grip the ground. Rivers cut across routes like unpredictable barriers, sometimes shallow and manageable, other times swollen and dangerous after storms. Crossing them requires coordination that cannot be rehearsed in advance. Riders must read currents, identify safe entry points, and anticipate how panic within the herd might cascade into loss of control. Weather introduces another layer of instability. Heat can slow movement to a near standstill, forcing early starts and late pauses. Cold nights compress rest into short intervals that may be interrupted by sudden movement or disturbance in the herd. Thunderstorms transform the landscape into a shifting field of sound and motion, where visibility collapses and direction becomes difficult to maintain. In such conditions, the cowboy's awareness extends beyond sight, relying on sound, pressure, and intuition shaped by repetition. Along these routes, small decisions accumulate into large consequences. A poorly timed turn can push cattle toward difficult terrain. A moment of hesitation near water can cause congestion that takes hours to resolve. Even the placement of riders at specific points around the herd influences how movement unfolds over time. Nothing is isolated. Every action feeds into a system that is constantly adjusting itself. Despite the chaos, cattle drives develop a kind of internal rhythm. Movement and rest alternate in patterns shaped by grazing needs and environmental limits. Herds are allowed to feed periodically, slowing the entire system into a temporary pause before motion resumes. These breaks are not luxuries but necessities, without which the animals would weaken before reaching their destination. The drive is therefore not continuous motion, but a cycle of controlled interruption. Food for the cowboys themselves is simple and repetitive. Meals are prepared under conditions that prioritize speed and efficiency over variety. Beans, salted meat, coffee, and hard bread form the core of sustenance, often consumed quickly before attention returns to the herd. Sleep is fragmented, taken in short intervals during moments of relative stability. Even rest is shaped by vigilance, as someone must always remain aware of sudden herd movement or environmental change. What is often overlooked in later interpretations is the emotional texture of these drives. There is boredom, certainly, in long stretches of uneventful riding. There is also tension, as the possibility of sudden disruption never fully disappears. But there is also a form of attentiveness that develops over time, a heightened sensitivity to small shifts in behaviour and environment. The cowboy becomes attuned to patterns that are not immediately visible, reading the herd almost as a single organism with its own logic. Communication among riders is minimal but precise. A gesture, a positioning shift, or a change in pace can carry more meaning than extended verbal instruction. In noisy or unstable conditions, silence becomes an advantage. Coordination emerges through shared understanding built over repeated experience rather than explicit planning. This allows small groups of riders to manage enormous moving systems with surprising efficiency. Still, the system is fragile. A single disturbance can ripple outward, breaking rhythm and forcing rapid response. A startled animal at the edge of the herd can trigger movement that spreads inward, compressing space and increasing pressure until control must be re-established through positioning and patience. Recovery from such moments requires both skill and calm, as panic within the herd often mirrors the emotional state of those guiding it. Over time, certain routes become familiar. Rivers are memorized not as fixed points, but as variable challenges depending on season and rainfall. Grazing areas are remembered for their reliability or unpredictability. Even weather patterns begin to form a kind of informal knowledge base, passed between riders through conversation and experience. Yet despite this familiarity, no drive is ever identical to the last. The combination of animals, conditions, and timing ensures constant variation. The cattle drive, at its core, is a temporary system of movement imposed on a landscape that does not naturally organise itself in this way. It exists only as long as attention is maintained, only as long as riders continue to adapt in real time to conditions that shift without warning. Once the herd reaches its destination, the system dissolves, leaving behind dust, fatigue, and the memory of motion across open land. A river appears on the horizon long before it is fully understood. At first it is only a darker line cutting through the land, a subtle interruption in the continuity of grass and dust. Then, as the herd approaches, it becomes something far less abstract. Sound changes. The air feels different. Animals begin to sense it before humans fully register its presence, shifting uneasily as the ground begins to slope downward toward water that cannot yet be seen clearly. For cattle drives, rivers are never just geography, they are thresholds of risk. Every crossing forces a temporary collapse of order, where thousands of animals must be guided through a narrow, unstable transition between one side of the landscape and another. There is no way to fully prepare for how a herd will behave in that moment. Even experienced riders know that control here is partial at best, dependent on timing, positioning, and a degree of luck that cannot be eliminated through skill alone. The approach itself is careful and deliberate. Riders spread out, studying banks, identifying shallows, and watching how the current behaves around obstacles. What looks calm from a distance may conceal deep channels or sudden drops. The herd is often held back for hours while this assessment takes place, building tension in both animals and humans. Cattle sense delay as much as they sense water, and uncertainty spreads through them like pressure building under the surface. When movement finally begins, it is rarely clean. The first animals to enter the water hesitate, then step forward, testing depth with uncertain footing. Behind them, pressure increases as the herd pushes forward, unable to fully see what lies ahead. The river becomes a narrowing funnel of motion, where flow is dictated by instinct and momentum rather than clear direction. Cowboys move along the edges, shouting, gesturing, positioning themselves to prevent collapse at critical points. Water changes everything about control. Sound is distorted. Distance becomes difficult to judge. A rider who was visible moments ago can disappear behind spray and movement. Horses must maintain balance against shifting ground beneath them, while also responding to panic or hesitation within the herd. In this environment, small mistakes can escalate quickly, as panic spreads more easily than stability. Some rivers are shallow and wide, allowing relatively smooth passage. Others are fast, deep, and unpredictable, especially after storms or seasonal flooding. In these cases, crossings can become prolonged events that stretch into hours, sometimes even days if conditions worsen. There are moments when entire herds must be halted upstream while waiting for water levels to drop or stabilize, creating bottlenecks that test both patience and endurance. Loss is an accepted possibility in these crossings. Even with careful planning, some animals may be swept downstream or separated from the herd entirely. The scale of drives makes full control impossible in absolute terms. What matters is maintaining enough cohesion that the herd continues to function as a unit after the crossing, even if some fragmentation occurs at the edges. Beyond rivers, storms present another form of environmental disruption that reshapes the structure of movement. Thunderheads can build quickly across the plains, transforming clear skies into vast systems of wind and rain. Visibility drops, sound becomes amplified or distorted, and the herd reacts with increased agitation. Lightning introduces additional danger, especially in open terrain where there is no natural shelter. In heavy rain, the ground itself changes behaviour. What was firm becomes slippery. What was dry becomes heavy with mud that clings to hooves and slows movement. Progress may become difficult or impossible for hours at a time. During such moments, cattle are often allowed to settle temporarily, forming tight groups that conserve energy until conditions improve. Riders remain alert, watching for shifts in weather and herd stability. Dust storms, in contrast, erase visibility almost entirely. The horizon disappears, landmarks vanish, and navigation becomes a matter of memory and proximity rather than sight. In these conditions, cowboys rely heavily on instinct and the sound of movement rather than visual cues. The herd itself becomes both guide and obstacle, a moving presence that must be followed and shaped without clear reference to the wider landscape. Across all of these environmental challenges, a consistent pattern emerges. Control is always conditional. It depends on timing, observation, and the ability to respond quickly to changing circumstances. There is no permanent solution to instability on the trail, only temporary alignment between human effort, animal behavior, and environmental conditions. What is often misunderstood in later interpretations of cattle drives is the level of constant vigilance required. There are no true moments of complete relaxation while the herd is in motion. Even during slower segments of travel, attention remains distributed across multiple layers of awareness terrain, weather, herd behavior, and the positioning of other riders. Fatigue is managed, not eliminated. Over time, certain environmental cues become deeply familiar. The sound of distant water before it is visible, the way wind shifts just before a storm arrives, the subtle tightening of herd formation that suggests unease. These signals are not always consciously analysed. They are absorbed through repetition until they become part of instinctive response. Yet even with this accumulated knowledge, unpredictability remains constant. No two crossings are identical. No two storms behave the same way. Each event introduces slight variations that require immediate adjustment. This is what makes the system both functional and fragile. It works not because it eliminates uncertainty, but because it continuously adapts to it. The river, the storm, and the dust are not obstacles separate from the cattle drive. They are part of its structure. Without them, the system would not exist in its current form. They define its limits, shape its risks, and determine the pace at which movement can occur across the land. And so the herd continues forward, not through a controlled environment, but through a landscape that resists control at every turn, shaped as much by water, wind, and weather as by the riders who attempt to guide it. The day on the trail does not begin with a clear start, but with a gradual return to motion. Somewhere in the dark hours before sunrise, small sounds begin to rise from the herd shifts of weight, low breaths, the occasional restless step that breaks the stillness of night. Cowboys wake not because time demands it, but because the system around them begins to move again. The herd is already anticipating departure long before the first rope is gathered or the first horse is saddled. Food is prepared quickly, almost mechanically, as if the act itself must not interrupt the larger rhythm of movement. Coffee is often the only consistent element, strong enough to cut through fatigue but never enough to fully erase it. Beans, cured meat, and hard bread form the backbone of sustenance, chosen not for comfort but for durability. Everything on the trail is designed around endurance rather than satisfaction, even warmth, when available. It's temporary and shared unevenly across a group that must keep moving. Sleep is fragmented into small intervals that depend entirely on herd stability. A cowboy may rest for an hour, then be called back into motion by a sudden shift in cattle behavior or a change in terrain. There is no guarantee of uninterrupted rest, only the possibility of brief pauses between demands. Over time, the body adjusts to this rhythm in ways that are not fully voluntary. Alertness becomes a default state, even during moments that appear calm from the outside. As the herd begins to move for the day, the trail resumes its slow expansion across the landscape. Dust rises almost immediately, carried by hooves and wind into a thin veil that follows the entire operation. Visibility shifts constantly depending on direction and speed. The herd itself becomes both the source and the consequence of this dust, shaping its own environment as it advances. Distance on the trail is not measured in fixed units, but in effort and condition. A short stretch of ground can take hours if terrain is difficult or if the herd is unsettled. Conversely, a long stretch may pass quickly if conditions align firm ground, calm animals, and favourable weather. Time becomes elastic, shaped more by circumstance than by any external schedule. Midday often brings the harshest conditions. Heat builds across the plains with little resistance, pressing down on both animals and riders. The herd slows, not from instruction, but from biological necessity. Movement becomes heavier, more deliberate, as energy is conserved. Riders adjust spacing, monitor hydration points, and watch for signs of strain within the herd. Even small changes in behavior can signal larger problems developing beneath the surface. Water becomes the central concern whenever it is available. Streams, shallow rivers, or temporary pools determine not only rest points but entire route decisions. A dry stretch of land without reliable water can force significant detours or delays. The search for water is constant, even when it is not immediately visible. Experience teaches riders to recognize subtle indicators in vegetation, soil colour, and animal movement that suggest proximity to hidden sources. The cattle themselves operate on a rhythm that is both predictable and fragile. They graze when allowed, rest when pressure decreases, and move when the group around them moves. This collective behaviour creates stability, but only as long as the herd remains coherent. If separation begins at the edges, the entire structure becomes vulnerable to fragmentation. Maintaining cohesion is therefore one of the most important and continuous responsibilities of the trail. Evening brings a partial easing of tension, though never a full release. Camps are established with the herd positioned in controlled formations, often in circular or semi-enclosed patterns that reduce the risk of scattering during the night. Horses are tended first, then equipment, then food. The order of priorities reflects the dependency structure of the entire system. Without horses, movement ends. Without cattle, the purpose of movement disappears. Without riders, cohesion collapses. Despite exhaustion, the end of the day is not silence. There is conversation, but it is limited, often focused on immediate concerns rather than storytelling or reflection. Information is exchanged about herd condition, weather expectations, and terrain ahead. This communication serves a functional purpose, reinforcing coordination for the following day. Even rest is partially structured by preparation. What often goes unnoticed in broader portrayals of trail life is the psychological effect of repetition. The same actions performed across changing landscapes create a strange duality of experience. On one hand, there is constant variation in environment. On the other, there is deep sameness in routine. The act of moving cattle, preparing camps, and maintaining vigilance repeats so consistently that it becomes a kind of internal rhythm detached from novelty. This repetition does not necessarily dull awareness. In many cases, it sharpens it. Small deviations become more noticeable precisely because the larger structure remains stable. A change in wind direction, an unusual herd formation, or a slight shift in animal behavior can stand out sharply against the background of routine motion. Over time, this sensitivity becomes one of the most valuable tools on the trail. There are also moments when exhaustion itself begins to shape perception. Fatigue alters the way distance is judged, how sound is interpreted, and how time is experienced. A short delay can feel extended. A long stretch of movement can blur into memory without clear boundaries. Yet even under these conditions, the system continues to function because it relies not on perfect perception, but on shared patterns of behavior among both riders and animals. By the end of each day, the trail settles into a temporary equilibrium. The herd is contained, the riders are positioned, and the landscape falls into relative stillness. But this stillness is always provisional. It exists only as preparation for the next cycle of movement. Nothing on the trail is truly finished until the destination is reached, and even then, the system dissolves only to be rebuilt elsewhere. The cowboy's life on the trail is therefore not a sequence of events, but a continuous loop of motion, adjustment, and endurance. Food, sleep, and distance are not fixed experiences but variables constantly reshaped by the demands of the herd and the land. Within this structure, survival depends less on strength than on persistence across repeating conditions that never fully resolve. The frontier is often remembered as a space of isolation, but along the cattle trails it is rarely empty. Movement draws other movements. Where herds pass, people follow, intersect, or resist. The open plains become a meeting ground of shifting presences, where different histories overlap without fully merging. Encounters on the trail are not rare interruptions, they are part of the structure of life in motion. Among the most complex of these encounters are those with indigenous nations whose territories and seasonal routes intersect with cattle drives. These are not static boundaries drawn on maps, but living landscapes shaped by long-established patterns of migration, hunting, and survival. Buffalo herds once moved through these same regions in vast numbers, and many indigenous communities built entire cultural and economic systems around following or managing those movements. By the time cattle drives expand across the plains, those systems have already been deeply disrupted by disease, displacement, and expanding settlement pressure. In some regions, cattle and buffalo ranges overlap, creating direct competition for grazing land and water sources. This overlap produces tension that is not abstract but immediate. Herds cannot easily be separated in space, and movement across shared terrain becomes a matter of negotiation through presence, pressure, and sometimes conflict. Cowboys entering these areas are often aware that they are moving through spaces already inhabited, even if official narratives of the time sometimes describe the land as open or unused. Historical records show a wide range of interactions. Some encounters involve avoidance, where herds are steered to minimize contact with nearby camps or traveling groups. Others involve trade or temporary cooperation, particularly in regions where practical exchange is possible. There are also moments of violence, often tied to broader patterns of territorial pressure and misunderstanding. No single narrative fully captures these interactions, and scholars still debate the extent to which conflict or coexistence defined specific regions and periods. What is clear is that the cattle economy does not develop in isolation from these dynamics. It expands into a landscape already shaped by centuries of human and ecological movement. The introduction of large-scale cattle drives adds another layer of pressure to systems that are already undergoing rapid change. Rivers, grazing areas, and migration corridors become shared points of stress, where different needs intersect in ways that are not easily resolved. At the same time, the cowboy's daily experience of these encounters is often filtered through immediate practical concerns. The priority remains maintaining herd cohesion and completing the drive. External groups encountered along the route are assessed in terms of risk, distance, and potential disruption rather than abstract political categories. This does not simplify the reality of those encounters, but it does shape how they are experienced in real time on the ground. There is also a quieter dimension to these interactions that rarely appears in simplified accounts. Knowledge moves in both directions, even when not formally acknowledged. Techniques of navigation, environmental reading, and animal behavior management often reflect long-standing indigenous understanding of the land. In some cases, cowboys adopt or adapt methods without always tracing their origins. The landscape itself becomes a shared teacher, even when social recognition is uneven. The presence of military forts and expanding settlement infrastructure adds another layer of complexity. These installations are positioned as points of control and protection, but in practice they often function as nodes within a larger system of movement, trade, and surveillance. Cattle routes pass near them, and information about conditions, conflicts, and terrain often circulates through or around these points. The frontier is not simply open space. It's increasingly structured by overlapping systems of authority. Despite these pressures, large stretches of the trail still feel vast and unregulated. In these spaces, the absence of permanent structures creates a sense of openness that is both real and misleading. Movement is unrestricted in theory, but constrained in practice by water sources, grazing availability, and the invisible boundaries created by prior use. The land carries memory not in a symbolic sense, but in the patterns of repeated movement etched into its geography. Conflicts that do occur are rarely isolated events. They're often connected to broader shifts in settlement patterns, resource competition, or political decisions made far from the trail itself. This distance between cause and immediate effect is one of the defining features of frontier life. A rider may experience tension or disruption without seeing the chain of decisions that produced it. The trail compresses complex histories into immediate moments of navigation and response. At the same time, there are periods of relative stability, where coexistence, avoidance, or informal boundaries allow movement to continue without direct confrontation. These periods are often fragile, dependent on environmental conditions and shifting pressures that can change rapidly. A drought, a new settlement, or a shift in herd routes can alter the balance without warning. What emerges from this layered reality is not a simple story of opposition, but a landscape of overlapping uses and interpretations. Different groups move through the same space with different assumptions about ownership, access, and purpose. The cattle drive becomes one of many systems operating simultaneously across the plains, each influencing the others in visible and invisible ways. For the cowboy, however, the immediate world remains defined by practical attention. Herd behavior, weather, terrain, and coordination take priority over broader context. Yet even within this narrow focus, the presence of others on the land is always felt. A distant campfire, a change in animal behavior, or an unexpected trail crossing can signal that the landscape is shared in ways that cannot be ignored. The frontier, in this sense, is not a boundary, but a convergence. And within that convergence, the cattle drive continues, shaped by forces that extend far beyond its own movement, even when those forces remain only partially visible to those guiding the herd forward. Violence on the frontier is often imagined as constant, erupting in sudden gunfire across empty streets and open plains. But the reality within cattle country is more controlled, more sporadic, and more closely tied to the structure of labour than later stories suggest. Most days on the trail pass without any conflict beyond the herd itself. The work is too demanding, too continuous, and too dependent on coordination for constant disruption to be sustainable. Even so, the presence of potential violence shapes behaviour in subtle and persistent ways. Firearms exist as tools, but they are not the centre of daily life. Their role is practical rather than theatrical, used for protection against predators or in rare situations where herd safety is at immediate risk. The idea of frequent gunfights between cowboys is largely a later cultural construction, amplified by stories, newspapers, and eventually entertainment industries that prefer dramatic clarity over operational reality. On the ground, discipline and routine matter far more than confrontation. Work itself imposes structure that limits chaos. Cattle drives depend on cooperation, timing, and restraint. A single act of uncontrolled aggression can scatter a herd and undo days of progress. For this reason, riders are selected and organised based not only on skill, but also on temperament. Reliability under pressure becomes more valuable than any display of force, even in towns where cowboys gather after long drives. The transition from work to leisure is shaped by exhaustion more than volatility. When conflict does occur, it is often linked to specific pressures rather than spontaneous confrontation. Competition over wages, disputes over cattle ownership, or tensions in rapidly growing boomtowns can escalate under conditions where law enforcement is limited or inconsistently present. These moments, while memorable, do not define the overall structure of cowboy life. They are interruptions within a system that otherwise depends on predictability. The cattle towns that emerge along railheads contribute significantly to the myth of widespread lawlessness. Places built quickly around economic opportunity tend to attract a mix of labourers, traders, gamblers, and opportunists. In these environments, alcohol, money, and temporary population surges create conditions where disputes are more likely to escalate. Yet even here, systems of informal order develop quickly. Agreements, reputations, and community enforcement often stabilise behaviour more effectively than formal institutions, at least in the earlier stages. Lawmen, where they exist, operate within a limited capacity. Their authority is often constrained by distance, resources, and the sheer speed at which these towns grow and change. As a result, much of the order that does exist is maintained through social expectation rather than institutional enforcement. People behave in ways that minimise disruption not because they are constantly restrained, but because instability threatens the economic system that brings them there in the first place. Within the trail itself, however, violence is structurally discouraged by necessity. Cowboys depend on one another too directly for survival and success. Trust is not abstract, it is operational, and mistaken coordination can cost livestock, time, and income. This creates an environment where cooperation is enforced through shared vulnerability rather than formal rule systems. Even individuals with different backgrounds or temperaments are bound by the demands of the herd. The physical exhaustion of trail life also plays a role in limiting conflict. Long hours of riding, constant alertness, and irregular rest reduce the likelihood of sustained confrontation. Energy is conserved for necessary tasks. Emotional intensity, when it appears, is often absorbed into fatigue rather than expressed outwardly. This does not eliminate tension, but it channels it into endurance rather than disruption. At the same time, the mythology of the armed cowboy begins to grow during this period. Newspapers and travelling accounts sometimes emphasise dramatic encounters, focusing on isolated incidents and presenting them as representative. Over time, these stories accumulate, creating a distorted image of constant danger and individual confrontation. The reality is more procedural, more dependent on group coordination, and less centred on personal duels or frequent gunplay. Even within boomtown environments, where conflict is more likely, patterns of behaviour tend to stabilise quickly after initial periods of chaos. Economic activity requires predictability. Merchants, transport operators, and ranchers all depend on a functioning system that cannot sustain continuous disruption. As a result, informal codes of conduct emerge, reinforced by repeated interaction rather than formal legislation alone. There is also a strong distinction between perception and daily experience. To outsiders, the frontier may appear as a space of unchecked risk and violence. To those living within it, especially cowboys moving cattle across long distances, it is primarily a space of labour, repetition, and environmental negotiation. Danger exists, but it is distributed across many forms: weather, terrain, fatigue, and animal behaviour rather than concentrated in human conflict. Scholars still debate how quickly and how fully the myth of the gunfighter cowboy diverged from the working reality of cattle labour. What is clear is that the transformation accelerated as storytelling, journalism, and later entertainment began to reinterpret frontier life through simplified narratives. These narratives emphasised individual action over collective systems, turning a cooperative labour environment into a stage for personal confrontation. In practice, however, survival on the trail depends on the opposite. It depends on coordination, restraint, and the ability to maintain stability under conditions that are already demanding enough without additional human conflict. The cowboy's daily existence is shaped far more by managing unpredictability in nature than by engaging in conflict with other people. And so, beneath the growing mythology of violence and individualism, the actual structure of cowboy life continues to operate as a system of controlled cooperation. It is a world where order is fragile but necessary, where discipline is practical rather than ideological, and where the greatest risks rarely come from human confrontation alone. If the cowboy world is remembered as a single image, it is usually narrow a lone rider against a wide horizon, defined by a uniform silhouette and a simplified identity. But on the actual trails and ranches of the cattle economy, that image dissolves quickly under the weight of reality. The workforce that sustained the cattle boom is far more diverse than later myth suggests, shaped by overlapping histories of migration, labour, displacement, an adaptation that rarely appear in simplified retellings. On the open range, skill matters more than origin. A rider who can handle cattle, read terrain, and maintain control under pressure becomes valuable regardless of where they come from. This practical reality opens space for a workforce that includes black cowboys, Mexican vaqueros, indigenous riders, and immigrants from various regions, all contributing to a system that depends on competence rather than uniform identity. Their presence is not symbolic, it is structural. Black cowboys, many of whom are formerly enslaved people or their descendants, play a significant role in post-Civil War cattle expansion, particularly in Texas and surrounding regions. They work as trail hands, wranglers, and ranch workers, often holding positions that require deep expertise in horsemanship and herd management. In many cases, their skills match or exceed those of their peers, yet historical visibility does not always reflect their contribution. On the trail itself, however, their work is essential to the functioning of the drive. Mexican vaqueros bring with them long-established traditions of cattle handling that predate the expansion of Anglo-American ranching systems. Their techniques in roping, riding, and herd control are deeply embedded in the practical foundations of cowboy labour. Over time, these methods are absorbed into the broader cattle economy, sometimes without explicit acknowledgement of their origin. Language, equipment use, and training practices all carry traces of this influence. Even as later narratives tend to simplify the cultural blending that occurs, indigenous participation in ranch labour also appears in various forms, shaped by changing political and territorial conditions. Some individuals work within cattle operations directly, while others engage in related forms of labour or trade. Their knowledge of land, water sources, and animal behaviour contributes to the broader functioning of frontier economies, even when not formally recorded in official accounts. As with other groups, their role is often underrepresented in later storytelling. Despite their presence in the historical record, what connects these diverse groups is not shared identity, but shared conditions. The cattle industry demands endurance, adaptability, and practical skill in environments that offer little margin for error. Those who can perform these tasks become part of the system regardless of background. On the trail, hierarchy is often shaped more by experience than by social status outside the work environment. This diversity extends beyond ethnicity into a broader spectrum of social and economic backgrounds. Many cowboys are young men seeking temporary employment, others are experienced workers moving between ranches, and some are seasonal labourers following cycles of demand. The cowboy role is not a fixed identity, but a position within a fluid labour network that expands and contracts with economic pressure. Despite this diversity in practice, later cultural memory compresses the image of the cowboy into something far more uniform. Literature, illustration, and early film industries begin to standardise the figure into a recognisable archetype, independent, solitary, and visually consistent. This process of simplification erases much of the complexity of the original labour system, replacing it with a symbol that is easier to reproduce and consume. Within the working reality of cattle drives, however, cooperation across differences is not optional. Herd management requires coordination among riders who must trust each other's timing and judgment under pressure. Communication on the trail depends on shared understanding of tasks rather than shared cultural background. A mistake in coordination has immediate consequences, and this creates a form of functional equality grounded in necessity. There is also a constant exchange of knowledge across these groups. Techniques for roping, riding, and herd control circulate informally, refined through shared work rather than formal instruction. Over time, this produces a blended skill set that reflects multiple origins while functioning as a unified system. The cowboy toolkit, in this sense, is not the product of a single culture, but of continuous adaptation across many. Even clothing and equipment reflect this blending. Practical designs emerge from multiple traditions, shaped by environmental demands rather than aesthetic preference. Boots, hats, saddles, and ropes evolve through use, incorporating features that improve durability, comfort, and control. What survives is what works, regardless of where it originated. Yet despite this functional diversity, recognition remains uneven. Some contributions are documented more clearly than others, while many individuals remain largely invisible in later historical accounts. Scholars still work to reconstruct a more accurate picture of who participated in the cattle economy and how their roles shaped its development. On the trail itself, however, identity is often secondary to function. A rider is judged by how well they can manage cattle, respond to sudden change, and maintain stability within a moving system. Reputation is built through performance rather than narrative. In this environment, difference does not disappear, but it becomes less important than capability. The cattle economy, when viewed from this perspective, is not a uniform cultural expression, but a layered system of labour shaped by necessity. It depends on the contributions of many groups whose skills converge in a shared environment of risk, distance, and endurance. The cowboy, as a working figure, emerges from this convergence rather than from a single cultural origin. And so, beneath the simplified image that will later dominate popular imagination, the real structure of cowboy life remains complex, diverse, and deeply interconnected. It is a system built not on uniform identity, but on the practical alignment of many different histories moving together across the same uncertain land. The image of the frontier often leaves out one of its most consistent presences, women whose labour quietly supports the entire structure of ranch life and settlement survival. In the cattle economy, their roles are not peripheral or occasional, but embedded in the daily functioning of households, ranches, and emerging towns. Yet because their work is less visible in the movement of herds across open land, it's often underrepresented in later narratives that focus on the more mobile aspects of cowboy life. On ranches, women contribute to a wide range of essential tasks that keep operations functioning. Food preparation alone is a continuous responsibility, requiring planning and endurance under conditions where supplies may be limited and storage unreliable. Meals must sustain workers engaged in physically demanding labour, often for long hours in unpredictable weather. This work is not occasional or secondary, it is constant, structured around the same rhythms of early rising and long days that define the rest of ranch life. Beyond food, women often manage domestic systems that extend into broader ranch operations. This can include maintaining clothing, repairing worn materials, managing supplies, and assisting with financial or logistical organisation depending on the size and structure of the ranch. In smaller operations, these responsibilities may overlap heavily with other labour, requiring flexibility and constant adaptation. The ranch, as a system, depends on this layered support structure to remain functional. In frontier towns connected to cattle economies, women also participate in economic life in varied and often overlooked ways. Some run boarding houses that provide essential lodging for travelling workers. Others operate food establishments, laundries, or small businesses that serve the constant flow of cowboys, traders, and settlers. These spaces become critical nodes in the infrastructure of movement, offering rest, information exchange, and temporary stability between long periods of travel. There are also women who engage directly in ranch work, particularly in smaller or family-run operations where roles are not strictly divided by gender. They may ride horses, assist with cattle handling, or participate in tasks traditionally associated with cowboy labour when circumstances require it. The flexibility of frontier life means that survival often depends on ability rather than category, especially in regions where labour is scarce and demands are high. Despite this reality, later cultural narratives tend to reduce women's presence in the cowboy world to background roles or symbolic figures. This simplification reflects broader patterns in how frontier history is remembered and represented, favouring highly visible forms of labour over equally essential but less dramatic contributions. The result is a distorted picture in which the functioning of entire systems appears to rest on a narrower base of participation than was actually the case. Historical evidence, however, shows that frontier communities could not operate without this broader labour network. Ranching economies required coordination between fieldwork, domestic support, supply management, and town-based services. Women's contributions connect these layers, forming a stabilising structure that allows more visible forms of labour, such as cattle driving, to occur at all. In addition to labour, women also play roles in education, communication, and community continuity. Schools in developing settlements are often organised or supported by women who ensure that basic education persists even in unstable or rapidly changing environments. Communication networks, including letter writing and informal information sharing, help maintain connections between scattered populations, reinforcing a sense of continuity across distance. Life in these environments is shaped by the same environmental pressures that affect all frontier inhabitants. Weather, isolation, and resource scarcity influence daily decisions. In many cases, adaptability becomes the defining requirement. Tasks shift depending on season, demand, and available labour. There is little separation between domestic and economic spheres, as both are shaped by the same underlying conditions of uncertainty and movement. What emerges from this structure is a more complete picture of frontier society, one that includes both visible and less visible forms of labour. The cattle drive may be the most dramatic expression of the cowboy economy, but it depends on a wider network of support that extends into homes, towns, and seasonal settlements. Without this network, the system would not function at the scale it does. Yet cultural memory often isolates the cowboy figure from this broader context. By focusing on the most mobile and visually striking aspects of frontier life, later narratives tend to overlook the interconnected systems that make such mobility possible. This selective emphasis creates a simplified image that does not fully reflect the complexity of the historical reality. Within the actual functioning of ranch and town life, however, roles are interdependent. Food production, logistical coordination, economic exchange, and herd management are all part of a single system that relies on constant cooperation across different forms of labour. Women's work is not separate from this system but integral to it, even when it does not appear in the more dramatic accounts of cattle drives or frontier conflict. There is also a quieter continuity in how knowledge is transmitted across these communities. Skills related to survival, resource management, and adaptation are passed through everyday practice rather than formal instruction. This includes both domestic and field-based knowledge, creating a shared environment where learning is embedded in daily life. Over time, as settlements stabilise and economies grow, some of these roles become more specialised. But during the height of cattle expansion, flexibility remains essential. The boundaries between different types of labour are fluid, shaped by necessity rather than rigid division. In this way, the cattle economy is revealed not as a system driven solely by riders on horseback, but as a broader social structure sustained by many forms of work operating together. The cowboy may be its most visible figure, but he is only one part of a much larger network that holds the frontier together through constant adaptation and shared effort. The sound of iron on iron begins to replace the rhythm of hooves long before the cowboy fully realises what is changing. It arrives quietly at first, in distant reports of rail lines advancing across plains that once required weeks of travel to cross. Then it becomes visible in the form of tracks cutting through open land, straight and deliberate in a way the landscape itself never is. The railroad does not follow terrain in the way cattle do, it imposes direction onto it. For the cattle economy, this shift is not sudden collapse but gradual restructuring. Railheads, once temporary endpoints of long drives, begin to move closer to the places where cattle are raised. What once required months of coordinated movement across open range can now be completed in shorter, more controlled segments. The long drive north becomes less essential as rail access expands deeper into previously remote regions. This change alters the very logic of movement. Cattle no longer need to be pushed continuously across vast distances. Instead, they can be transported in stages, reducing exposure to environmental risk and shortening the time between ranch and market. For ranchers, this increases efficiency. For cowboys, it slowly reduces the scale and necessity of traditional drives that once defined their labour. The transformation is not only logistical but spatial. The open range, once defined by fluid boundaries and seasonal movement, begins to be segmented by fences, rail lines, and formal land claims. The introduction of barbed wire, in particular, changes how land is used and controlled. Where cattle once moved freely across shared grazing areas, they are now increasingly confined to designated spaces. This alters migration patterns, grazing behaviour, and the structure of ranch management itself. As fencing expands, conflicts over land use become more frequent and more localised. The open system of shared range that once supported large-scale movement begins to fracture into smaller, controlled units. Some ranchers adapt quickly, adopting closed grazing systems. Others struggle with the loss of mobility that had defined earlier cattle operations. The cowboy, positioned within this transition, experiences it as a change in daily rhythm rather than as a single historical turning point. Railroads also change the nature of timing. Markets become more tightly connected to production cycles. Delays or disruptions in transport have immediate economic consequences. Where cattle drives once absorbed uncertainty through distance and time, rail systems compress that uncertainty into shorter, more intense periods. The margin for error narrows significantly. Towns that once served as seasonal railheads evolve into permanent settlements. Their economies diversify beyond cattle, incorporating agriculture, trade, manufacturing, and services. The transient boomtown atmosphere gives way to more structured communities with established institutions. Law enforcement becomes more formalised, infrastructure more stable, and economic activity less dependent on seasonal influxes of livestock. For many cowboys, this transition means a shift in employment patterns. The long, continuous cattle drives that once required large crews become less common. Work moves closer to ranches or becomes seasonal in different ways. Some riders adapt by taking on more specialised roles within enclosed ranch systems. Others move between regions in search of remaining open-range work. The identity of the cowboy begins to fragment as the system that sustained it changes shape. Yet the cultural memory of the open range persists, even as its practical foundation weakens. Stories of long drives, wide horizons, and unbounded movement continue to circulate, increasingly detached from the evolving economic reality. The cowboy becomes a symbol of a disappearing system even while elements of that system still function in altered forms. Scholars often note that this period is not a sudden end but a transition stretched across decades. Rail expansion is uneven. Some regions remain open longer than others. Certain areas continue to support traditional cattle drives well into the late stages of the frontier period. What changes is not an immediate disappearance, but a gradual reduction in scale and necessity. Environmental pressures also contribute to this transformation. Intensive grazing during the height of cattle expansion begins to show long-term effects on certain regions of the plains. Vegetation patterns shift, water sources become more strained in some areas, and land management practices adapt in response. These ecological changes interact with technological and economic shifts, reinforcing the move away from unrestricted open-range systems. Within this evolving landscape, the cowboy's role becomes more specialised and less central. Riding skills, herd management, and trail coordination remain valuable, but they are applied in different contexts. Shorter drives, fenced operations, and more localised labour replace the vast multi-month migrations of earlier decades. The work continues, but its scale and rhythm are fundamentally altered. What remains consistent is the underlying dependence on coordination between humans, animals, and land. Even as railroads and fences reshape movement, cattle still require management, and ranch systems still rely on skilled labour. The cowboy does not disappear in this transition, but he is absorbed into a different structure of work that is less expansive and more contained. In this shift, a deeper change is taking place in how space itself is understood. The open, continuous frontier gives way to a segmented landscape of ownership, infrastructure, and regulated movement. Distance is no longer something to be crossed in a single sustained effort, but something divided into manageable units connected by fixed points. And as this new structure takes hold, the world that once made long cattle drives necessary begins to recede into memory, even while its physical traces remain embedded in roads, towns, and rail lines that continue to shape movement across the land. What remains of the cowboy does not disappear with the end of the long cattle drives. It changes shape, slowly at first, then more visibly as time separates memory from function. The work that once stretched across open plains becomes fragmented into smaller roles, absorbed into ranch systems, rail logistics, and regional labour networks. Yet the image of the cowboy continues to grow, even as the original conditions that produced him begin to fade. The transformation from working figure to cultural symbol happens gradually through storytelling. Newspaper accounts, travelling performers, early photography, and later film all begin to compress the complexity of frontier labour into a more recognisable form. The cowboy is simplified into a character defined by independence, solitude, and motion across open land. What was once a collective, highly coordinated labour system becomes, in memory, an individual experience. This simplification is not entirely accidental. It reflects a broader need to make sense of a rapidly changing world, as railroads, industrial agriculture, and urban expansion reshape the American landscape. The open range becomes harder to directly experience. The cowboy, therefore, becomes a vessel for a kind of imagined continuity with that disappearing space. He represents something that feels stable even as the conditions that created him no longer dominate daily life. In reality, the late stages of cowboy work are far more constrained. Fenced ranches, shorter drives, and localised cattle management replace the vast migrations that once defined the profession. Labour remains physically demanding, but its geography is reduced. Movement becomes cyclical rather than expansive, tied to specific properties rather than open corridors of land. The horizon, once a working boundary, becomes more of a visual background than a destination. As this shift deepens, the cowboy figure begins to separate into two parallel forms, the working reality and the cultural memory. The working reality continues in reduced but still meaningful forms of ranch labour. The cultural memory expands rapidly, shaped by entertainment industries that favour clarity, drama, and recognisable archetypes. Over time, the symbolic cowboy becomes more widely known than the historical one. Yet traces of the original system remain embedded in modern landscapes. Rail lines still follow corridors first opened during the cattle boom. Towns that began as temporary railheads continue as permanent settlements. Ranching practices still carry techniques developed through earlier generations of vaquero and cowboy labour. The system does not vanish so much as it disperses into different layers of infrastructure and culture. What is often lost in simplified memory is the sheer scale of cooperation that defined the original cattle economy. It was never a solitary endeavour, It depended on networks of riders, ranch workers, suppliers, towns, and transport systems, all operating within a shared but unstable environment. The cowboy was one part of a larger structure that only functioned through constant coordination across distance and uncertainty. Even the landscape itself retains signs of that period. Trails become roads, crossing points become bridges, grazing routes influence property boundaries. In some regions, faint traces of cattle paths remain visible in the way terrain has been shaped by repeated movement over time. The land carries these imprints quietly, long after the original system of motion has changed. Scholars often describe this transition not as an ending, but as a reconfiguration. The forces that shape the cowboy world economy, environment, technology, and migration do not stop. They reorganize into new forms. The cowboy, as a labor identity tied to open-range cattle drives, diminishes in importance. But the systems he was part of evolve into new structures of agriculture, transport, and regional development. The myth, however, grows in the opposite direction. As the practical reality becomes less visible, the symbolic version becomes more prominent. It is carried forward in stories that emphasize individual skill over collective labor, freedom over coordination, and simplicity over complexity. This myth does not replace history, but it often overshadows it in public imagination. Still, beneath both memory and myth, there remains the quieter reality of what life actually was long hours in motion, shaped by animals, weather, terrain, and the constant requirement to adapt. A world where survival depended not on isolation, but on participation in systems far larger than any single rider. And when the dust of that world finally settles in historical memory, what remains is not a single figure standing alone on the horizon, but a vast network of movement, labour, and adaptation that once stretched across an entire continent, briefly aligning land, animals, and human effort into a single, fragile rhythm before shifting into something entirely new.